Morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session on procurement and contract management for catering contracts. So for most schools, when catering is outsourced, the contract with your catering provider is one of the most valuable to which you're likely to be a party. And it's important not just because of the high cost of the services. The quality of catering provision is an important and very visible part of your school's overall offering. Choice, quality, sustainability have all become increasingly important to pupils and to parents, and the people engaged by your caterer to provide the service that will be a daily feature of your pupil's school life. When it's done well, a high quality catering provision can be a really important tool in your pupil recruitment armoury. But if things go wrong, the reputational and financial cost to your school could be significant. So this morning we'll be looking at a few important parts of the process of dealing with your catering provider. But we'll be focusing on what you can do to help ensure that the catering provision achieves the quality and the standards that you and your parents expect at a cost that you're comfortable with. Now, I expect most of today's audience will be at different stages of their relationship with your caterer, and some of you may be providing that function in-house. Whether you've recently appointed a new provider, perhaps you're thinking about retendering, or you've had the same provision in place for many years and are comfortable with the services that you're getting, I hope this session will give you a few useful suggestions in managing those relationships. So what will we focus on this morning? We'll look at some of the key features of your catering contract, with a focus on costs and budget management and service delivery, and some suggestions on where you should focus your attention in managing that contract. We'll look at some recommendations to bear in mind when thinking about going out to tender for a new or replacement provider. We'll briefly consider what the last year has meant for the relationship between schools and their catering providers, and what trends we see being carried forward into the future. First, by way of introduction, my name is Ed Rimmell. I'm a partner in the commercial team at VWV. A good deal of my time is spent advising schools on their contractual arrangements with third-party suppliers, all sorts of third-party suppliers, but particularly their catering providers. My focus is on preparing and negotiating the contract at the start of the relationship. I've also supported a good number of schools, along with colleagues in our dispute resolution team, where things have gone wrong, particularly around overcharging from caterers, perhaps around early termination, and in the last 12 months around the operation of force majeure clauses in connection with COVID. Who'd really heard about force majeure outside of legal teams up until about 12 months ago. I'm very grateful to Simon Pollard for joining us this morning. Simon is Managing Director of ISCC, a leading catering consultancy to independent schools. And I know that he'll be well known to lots of you already. So I'll pause here and I'll ask Simon if he could introduce himself properly, if he could then get us started with some reflections on the last 14 months, and with some of his thoughts on where your energies are best focused in catering contract management. Simon.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Ed. Yes, so Simon Pollard, founder and managing partner of ISCC, which we founded in 2007. We work exclusively in the independent school sector and are market leaders in that sector. So we have a huge amount of knowledge and experience. We've worked with over 400 schools and have managed over 150 competitive tenders. Just for information, ISCC, we're not just catering consultants, but also we're very busy providing cleaning and housekeeping support, kitchen design, and food purchasing for self-managed schools. Personally, my background is in independent school catering, and I've previously been sales director for Sodexo and divisional managing director for a company called Ellie, looking after their education and healthcare division. Some may refer to me sometimes as a poacher term gamekeeper, but I'll let you make up your own minds after we've finished this session. So really what I'd like to start by doing is just reflecting perhaps on the last 12, 14 months where things, kind of what's happened and from a caterer's point of view, and the contract caterers in particular. So I think for the first time in a very long time, the caterers have all really pulled together and have worked together. They've supported governmental schemes, and also they've done a lot of charitable work. There's one company who have actually provided over 1 million meals as part of their Kitchen Social Hub initiative. I think all caterers, especially who work in the state sector, have spent a lot of time and energy and money working from those kitchens, providing free meals for the vulnerable and also meals for NHS workers. So, like I say, it's actually brought a lot of the caterers together because they've been working on these initiatives together. I think as well, definitely worth saying that the catering departments in independent schools, the caterers, whether you're outsourced or self-managed, have all worked incredibly hard over the last 12 months. It's been a really, really difficult time for the catering department. They've had some real challenges around, for example, creating bubbles in kitchens and different, completely separate shifts, through to having to remove salad bars and coming up with alternatives, and kind of having to really take into consideration social distancing at all times within the catering service, which, believe me, is not an easy task and has taken a huge amount of time and effort. So if you are one of those people, thank you so much for that effort that you've put in. It's been superb. In terms of the caterers, some companies have really been quite badly hit, especially those who have a large presence in the business and industry or venue catering portfolio. I mean, as you can imagine, that part of their business has basically closed. Actually, the areas of their businesses that have stayed open are education, state schools, independent schools, and healthcare, whether that's long-term healthcare or NHS. But there's really been some huge downturns in terms of revenue for a lot of the larger caterers. This has really led to some of them having to refinance using venture capitalists. Others have taken sizable loans. Larger FTSE companies have had equity raise. Compass Group raised £2 billion worth of new equity, and some others have sold to other caterers. So the WSH Group, which is part of the Holroyd Howe Group, bought a company called Bartlett Mitchell. But all of them, without doubt, have really had unprecedented downturn in income as their purchasing volumes have collapsed. And I'll talk about how that kind of relates to their income a little bit later on. We've also found that investment models have changed in the last year. I'm sure you're all familiar with contract caterers investing in kitchen facilities in return for an extended tenure. But actually, they've had to keep that cash in the business. And they've moved now really towards more offering rebate to offset operating costs rather than upfront investment. One of the other models they're looking at is perhaps putting off any refurbishment for a couple of years and banking that rebate so that it's already been earned, and then they can offer it as investment. So there have been some key changes there. I just wanted to move on now and talk about contract key features. And I'm sure you're all aware that obviously with independent schools being charities, that the financial model, the commercial model, is known as a cost plus arrangement. And I just wanted to explain what that is. So cost plus is quite simply where all the operating costs, whatever they are directly passed through to the school. And that can have benefits, it can have risk. And a little bit later on, I'm going to talk about what that doesn't mean is an open checkbook for your caterer. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's how the commercial side of the contracts are set up. If you were to be fixed price, then actually VAT will be attributable on the entire account. So that would include all catering labour that's obviously non-vatable at the moment, and even all food that's obviously non-vatable at the moment as well. So if you do have a form of fixed price contract with your caterer, and I have seen those, and I've just actually been working with a school recently who still has that in place, then you really need to make sure that it becomes a cost plus. But I will talk about some caps and guarantees a little bit later on. I've already spoken about the role of discounts and rebates, and I just want to go through that in a little bit more detail. So all catering companies, whether your caterer tells you or not, but all catering companies earn volume-related discounts, both on your specific supplies, but also then on their combined company purchasing by supplier volume. So rebates are returned dependent on that volume, not only from the suppliers, but also manufacturers. And I know there's a couple of catering managers here, and I know that they've worked for contractors before. But that's an interesting scenario because you may see that certain products have been delisted by a caterer, and you're wondering why, for example, you can't get Heinz tomato ketchup and you have to buy HP tomato ketchup as an example. It's actually to push the purchases down the route of going to specific suppliers so that they get a higher volume with that supplier, manufacturer, and then also then they get their higher rebate levels coming back through as income. So the world of rebates is still shrouded in mystery and secrecy, but be assured that it is in place with all of your catering suppliers. Even if your caterer says that they would like to use the kitchen designer and fit out company, they will be receiving a discount from those suppliers. And this is how it works really. So your supplier, sorry, your caterer will have what's known as a PLOF, and a PLOF basically is your product list, and it'll be your top items that are used on a regular basis. These prices generally will be really competitive because those are the prices that schools will compare their prices against either other schools who use different caterers or through ourselves when we're doing a benchmark. But actually, it's all the other products that you use, and that's called off-PLOF. Very funny term, but basically that's for all the food that isn't on your kind of high purchase volume list. And those foods will have really high markups on them. So if you look at some items, for example, gelatine, you will be paying a lot of money for that product because it's not used on such a regular basis. And because it's not used on a regular basis, then actually it's not very often that you would benchmark those prices because you only buy 4 or 5 boxes of gelatine, for example, a year. So that's something to look out for. It is really important to have a shopping basket of your top 100 items, and this is whether you're self-operated or outsourced. It's good to have those items, the prices identified, obviously with pack sizes, etc., and then on a termly basis at the end of each term to do a review of those prices, to put the new prices alongside the prices that were from last term, and to have a look at those and see how inflated they are. We supply both the ISBA and our clients with monthly Office for National Statistics food inflation data, and you really need to be looking back at any price increases that have been shown through the shopping basket and comparing those against the actual ONS rate. It could be that some caterers mark up some of their prices in order to retain a little bit more discount, but that's something that you really need to stay on top of. One area that is notoriously marked up by contract caterers is the sundry items, cleaning materials, tin foil, cling film, etc. We recommend that the school actually purchase those on the caterer's behalf because normally you can get those about 30% cheaper. Again, because they're not high volume items and also because they're very difficult to get a true comparison of product to product, they're an area where there is a high markup. So if you are outsourced, then I would suggest that that's an area that you do a mini shopping basket on, comparing your contract caterers prices to the prices that you could get yourself if you were to approach a similar supplier. My task then on your behalf, if you're able to require any support from us, is to negotiate as much of this rebate back as possible, either to be used for investment, whether that be upfront or mid-term, or to help offset your operating costs. Again, I've been working with a couple of schools who actually weren't receiving any rebate. And if you're not, you really need to ask your caterer why you're not and how much they're earning and how much they can return to you. Have a look at your contract maybe before you have those conversations as well. If you have a caterer's contract rather than your own contract, the VWV contract, then actually, again, the caterer's retention of discounts will be really shrouded in smoke and mirrors. and it'll more than likely say that they can retain discounts but are under no obligation to return any of these to you, as long as their prices are competitive. So have a check of that, and perhaps speak to Ed if it's an area of concern and something that you want to kind of tackle and investigate. Our contracts with the VWB contract that we use is very specific in this area. It acknowledges that caterers retain discounts, and then it also lists the level of discount that they will return to you on a monthly or annual basis. And certainly when you either come to extend your contract with your incumbent caterer, so you're renewing your contract, or whether you're choosing a new caterer or starting with a new caterer, that's when you need to have a school contract rather than a caterer's contract, so the VWB contract. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the income that caterers generate from their business. So on average, a caterer will earn between about 10 and 12% of your overall catering account turnover. Turnover being food, labour and sundries. And that quite simply is split into profit, maybe 3 to 5%, and then the cost of all the support and overheads to run their business, which is probably another 5 to 7%. So your caterer, depending, perhaps if they're a smaller caterer with lower overheads, they can be earning maybe 10, but if you employ one of the larger caterers, then they're probably earning 12%. And yes, that's earned through retention of discount and having a visible management fee. If you look at your management fee and use the turnover of the account again, the food, labour and sundry items, if you're a large school, probably with over £500,000 in turnover, the fee should represent between about 4 and 5% of the overall school account turnover, and probably between 5 to 7% for a smaller school, less than £500,000 turnover. I've also said here, but watch out for hidden income streams, and that's something that I'm going to discuss a little bit later on as well. So there is that other third potential income stream. I talked about actually a cost plus account not being an open checkbook. And really those days of having that open checkbook are now gone. If you're running a straight cost plus account where you pay every single cost no matter what it is, then I really would suggest that you look at your the commercial aspects of your budget and contract, because you should be looking for your caterer to fix or cap varying expenditure lines, such as your core feeding costs, especially if they've been your caterer for a number of years. Then they can fix those costs to give you some assurity of not overspending. If you have a cafe, then they can fix the gross profit projection. So again, they will take the hit if, say, for example, you're making a 60% profit or budgeted 60% profit and you're only achieving 55, then they will take the hit on that rather than you. You can also cap labour costs. Fixing labour costs isn't great, but capping it maybe by 5%, so that if they're not managing their labour contingency well, and there are recruitment costs or the use of agency staff, then you can again have some assurity that they're not going to overspend by more than whichever cap that you agree. So you can't have it fully fixed price account, but you can go some way to really getting it so that it's providing you with assurance that any overspend that is as a result of something that the caterer does actually sits with the caterer. Just moving on and talking about budget management. Well, first of all, ask for a draft version for the following academic year, probably starting, as most of you do, January, February time. Let them know that this is only the draft though, and that you will firm this up prior to the start of the new academic year. I do see, for example, schools who agree with their food inflation rate right the way back in February for not only the rest of that academic year, but for the following academic year. Really that needs to be adjusted literally at the time of the new academic year budget going live, based on your caterers information and perhaps based on some of the information that we send out as well. So just keep that area floating, and also as well, obviously looking at minimum wage, etc. We do see on a regular basis contract caterers trying to persuade their clients to budget more food inflation actually than they really do need to. So it can be overstated, and that's really for two reasons. The first, quite obviously, is it makes achieving their budget easier, so it takes the pressure off them. But the second is that by allowing an increased food inflation, it actually increases their purchases and so increases their rebates. So they do have a little bit of an ulterior motive if they want you to try and accept, 6, 7, 8% food inflation, when really at the moment food inflation is, well, it's still negative at the moment, but we're predicting it's going to be probably between 1 and 3%, maybe 5% at the most. So just looking at costs to look out for. So there are potentially some hidden income streams, and again, for those in the audience today who've worked for contract caterers will know that there's always a charge for IT, and actually the charges for IT should sit within your caterer's management fee, within that 4 to 5% of your account turnover, rather than it being charged as an extra. And I've seen charges of up to £1,500 a year for an IT system, and when that's obviously a 5-year contract tenure, you're talking some serious amount of potential extra income and extra cost for you, but income to the company. Look out also for insurances. Again, they should sit under the contractor's fee. Health and safety support, travel, training charges. They're all areas where they can, the contract caterer can charge you, and actually it supports their income. And watch out also for agency staff. Agency staff is an area that's highly marked up by contract caterers. I was talking with a school actually who's recently gone in-house, and it was the one area that they said they've seen the biggest saving. So they've gone directly to the same agency, and there's a huge variance between the cost that they were being charged compared to now that they're self-operated. Also, there's an area on your invoices that you can always have a look at to see what is being put through as is an additional charge, and that actually is the VAT element that's added onto your monthly invoice. I would always ask for a breakdown of that VAT element, because if training is charged, if IT is charged, if extra labour, agency labour is charged, then it all attracts VAT. So you can actually work backwards from the value of the VAT to actually see whether they're putting through any additional charges. So it does provide you with a visible trail. Another area to closely monitor is internal issue prices, and this actually is, I apologise for those who are self-operated who are listening in today, but this is another area that's for both self-operated and outsourced schools. We do see quite a bit of marking up of internal issue prices, when actually they should absolutely be charged at cost, and contractually, if you're outsourced, that absolutely should be written into your contract. So we do see these being marked up, and whilst the company doesn't make any additional income from this practice, what it can do actually is disguise any overspends in your core feeding account. So by marking up, for example, a cup of tea, which genuinely should cost about 10 pence, marking it up and putting it at 50 pence, it's taking 40p out of your core feeding account and putting it into your internal issue account. And that will then make your core feeding account look better than it actually is trading. And it can mask any overspend. So whilst you think, well, actually, it's only moving it from one account to another, if it was left within your core feeding, you'd want to know why there's an overspend, and also what your caterer is going to do about bringing that overspend back in line. So that's certainly an area that I think you really need to concentrate on. Another area is budgeting for 100% uptake at all meal services, when in reality this just isn't the case, particularly at boarding schools, dependent obviously on your policy. But we see certainly at supper time, and most definitely at weekends, Friday supper, Saturday supper, and weekend feeding, where there are reduced numbers and your catering budget should reflect that reduction. By not reflecting it, really what you're doing is allowing for further budgetary allowance for all of your meals. So, if you have £1.35 for lunch, but you have, or for supper, and you have 100% uptake, but only 90% turn up, then you're adding an extra 15 pence allowance for each of those meals. So, definitely something to check for, as well. Also, as checking for periods when pupils are out of school for exams, etc., and checking that all your exec weekends are budgeted for as well. Also, have a look out for markup on some internal issues such as packed lunches, and also check that only the variance in cost between the cost of your packed lunch and a normal meal is actually being charged to you on your internal issue account. And this also is the same for working lunches. If you have 12 teachers who are having a working lunch, then actually it shouldn't be the full value of that working lunch. It should be the value of the working lunch minus the food allowance that you already have budgeted for those members of staff. And this is an area that's often overlooked. Just looking in a little bit more detail at your monthly invoices, just be careful and watch out for some accruals and carry forwards. They can again mask an overspend, and we've been involved with quite a number of schools where these have been identified. And for example, if the caterer overspends by £500, they'll carry that forward to the following month with the intention then of saving £500 and putting it through in that month. But actually, I'm sure, like us, you would rather see how your account is actually trading and what your caterer is going to do over the next month and the effect of that in order to recuperate that £500. We have seen occasionally issues where there's an overspend and then suddenly things like grated cheese disappears off a salad bar, or items are kept behind the counter and you have to ask for them. And I'm sure that's not something that you would want in terms of affecting your service. So again, it's much better for your caterer to identify any overspends. Just looking at monitoring your actuals versus budget, and again, this is for self-operated as well as outsourced schools. So your caterer needs to prepare an accurate phased budget, and that needs to be done prior to the start of the academic term, and also that needs to be agreed by you as well, that it is accurate, because it needs to be phased dependent on the number of trading days, plus also take into account areas such as exeats and the half terms, orders, meal arrangements when they come back, and again, as I've said already, the reduced numbers at exam times. But once you have this phased budget, then your caterer then should present their actual cost of providing a service against your budgeted phased cost. And that is a really clear way of identifying exactly how they're trading at that point in time. After a few months, they will then be able to start to provide you with year-end forecasts, but these only really become relevant probably with about the last term prior to the budget end. Also as well, something I very rarely see, but is really relatively easy to do, and that is to work out on a monthly basis what your actual cost per head has been per pupil, per member of staff. This is really easily done by taking your core feeding overall food expenditure and having probably tray counts, which are the easiest way of counting meals rather than plates. And then simply dividing your overall expenditure by the number of meals that have actually been taken. And that again gives you a really good indicator, rather than perhaps expressing a saving or an overspend of £1,000, looking at actually what that means on a per cost basis, per head. Interesting data. I've also just thought I'd talk a little bit about authorising some expenditure. You should really consider having some of your overhead expenditure pre-authorised. Certainly recruitment, and especially if they're using agencies and their fees, 15, 16% on a salary maybe from a manager of 35, 40,000. These are some considerable costs, and I've worked with schools where they really weren't expecting that cost to come through when it came through and to be that amount. So always ask for pre-authorization on that type of expenditure. The same for travel and accommodation costs and also light equipment. And I'd also consider having a pre-authorization value on internal issues. So obviously it would be with you in terms of the value, but for example, if it was an event over £300, I would have somebody probably within the bursary just signing off to say, yes, that's fine, and we agree with your costings, rather than potentially when it does maybe become a bit of an open checkbook, when they'll suddenly put a bill forward for £2,000 for a very large event that you weren't expecting. And finally, just looking at benchmarking then of your catering costs. So we actually produce catering benchmark data for the ISBA, and actually I sent VWV a copy of this, and I know it's going to be sent out to you. So that is certainly something that is really worthwhile doing, checking how your food costs compare to the sector average, and also how your labour costs and sundry costs, and ultimately fee as well, so your overall cost of catering. So I'm now going to pass it back to Ed. He's going to talk a little bit about the importance of your contract terms in facilitating that good practice.
Thanks, Simon. That's really interesting stuff, and I can sense a bunch of well-informed conversations happening with caterers over the next few weeks. I expect they can anticipate that coming. In practice, where you have a healthy relationship with your catering provider, and you take an active role in contract management, lots of that good practice that Simon's just described, now that you're sort of well informed about some of the detail of how those budgets and invoices and so on are put together, a lot of that good practice is likely to happen in the ordinary course of operation in the contract, where you'd hope that it might. Very often, that contract management might happen without either party really consulting the detailed contract terms. In our experience, the contracts that often end up in dispute, or if not in dispute, those that end up with frustration between the parties as to how the services are being provided and the cost of the services, they tend to be the contracts where those good contract management practices aren't really addressed in the agreements, or at least where they are addressed, they're not then operated regularly in practice. I'll talk in a few minutes about the process for contracting with a new provider, and the importance of making sure that your agreement gives you the levers that you need to make sure that your provider delivers on all those promises of quality and value that they make when tendering to be appointed. But once appointed, it's important that you know what tools you have at your disposal to make sure that you're getting the service that you expect, but in practice, that you use those tools. So if you have the opportunity and the ability in your contract to benchmark costs, or to require your caterer to demonstrate that they're securing best value, or to take certain items away from the caterer and to procure them elsewhere yourself, it's far more effective to require your caterer to make incremental adjustments frequently than it is to seek very, very material adjustments a number of years into the contract. So disputes that we see with caterers tend to involve perhaps cost inflation or performance failings that have gone unchecked over a number of years. Very often those disputes come to light when perhaps a new bursar is appointed and they start to look under the bonnet of key contracts of the school. But by that time, it's often too late to do very much about historic cost inflation. Invoices have long been levied and payments made, and poor performance in key areas may well have become embedded. So at that stage, it can be really difficult to bring about very material change. And you run the risk where you have tools in your contract, but you fail to use them, of being treated as having waived your right to subsequently exercise those rights. This can make it even more difficult to secure remedies for poor performance if you don't keep on top of that performance in real time. If you know what tools are available and you proactively use them, perhaps you engage a Simon or his ilk to support you in monitoring and assessing performance and budgetary performance, but the risk of that runaway train can be much reduced, and your caterer will be better able to correct that poor performance before it gets too embedded. Using KPIs, performance indicators, can be an important part of that armory. One of the challenges with any service contract is to know what constitutes good performance and what constitutes poor performance, and what the consequences should be where parts of the service can't perform to the standard expected, if the budget is running away with itself, or if there's excess use of agency staff above what's been budgeted for, and so on. How can you test whether that's too much, and how do you identify what the consequences should be? The absence of a clear performance management mechanism, your route to correcting that, what you consider to be poor performance, is to identify a provision in your contract that you think has been breached, and to then try to demonstrate that that breach has resulted in the school suffering some loss. So it's the threat of a potential claim against the caterer that in those circumstances you hope will prompt improved performance. But in practice, even where you're able to find a breach of contract, demonstrating the loss flowing from that breach can be really difficult. And unless the breach is extremely serious, then demonstrating that the breach is sufficiently serious to justify termination can also be very difficult. And getting that process wrong can expose you to your own liabilities to the caterer. So without a robust performance management regime, contractual enforcement of good performance, holding that caterer to the promises it made in its tender, is really tough. And in those circumstances, whilst you might be able to manage that poor performance through your relationship with the caterer, if that relationship becomes strained, your contractual options are quite difficult, quite limited. It might not come as a huge surprise, therefore, that most caterers' standard contract terms don't contain meaningful performance management regimes in them. So how do you fix this? Well, the solution is to have a meaningful performance management regime that you all agree at the outset contains measurable performance indicators and a process for measuring that performance, and it's implemented regularly in practice by the school. But for a performance management regime to work well, my view is you need to concentrate on whether the regime is one that you'll be able to operate in practice. There's always a risk that a really in-depth KPI regime that measures dozens of metrics that all look fantastic at the start of the contract, in practice it's defeated by its complexity. Whilst it looks really robust on paper, the day-to-day practicalities of operating that regime can mean that over time, they're less likely to be used as intended. So my view is it's always better to have a smaller number of really important measurables that are robustly enforced, rather than a large number of KPIs that just aren't implemented in practice. As I said earlier, the risk of not using those tools, if you have that large number of KPIs that you don't implement, is that when things go really wrong and you look to rely on those tools, you might find they're no longer there for you, because you're treated as having waived those rights. Simon, I know you get involved in the day-to-day operation of KPIs from schools. What do you see that tends to work well and what works less well?
Yeah, sure, Ed. I think what's interesting is KPIs really come into their own when perhaps a caterer's been at school for a number of years. Once a caterer is first awarded a contract, the first year, obviously, everything is thrown at that contract and it's absolutely fantastic. And then perhaps over years 2, 3, 4, 5, the level of support perhaps wanes, and perhaps the service isn't going quite as fast forward as you would expect it to be. And that's when KPIs are absolutely essential. And also in terms of capturing and the number of visits that the caterer's staff personnel should visit the school. It's really important to have those KPIs. But yes, they work very well when they're used regularly and are enforced. And as Ed has said, actually to have less is more here. So perhaps have a set of 20 KPIs, but not all set in stone KPIs, ones that perhaps change on a regular basis depending on the business plan that your caterer has put forward for the following years, that certain elements of that are reflected within the KPIs. Food is really actually it's really subjective, food, isn't it? And KPIs, some of the KPIs can be subjective. So what is a really nice dish of lasagna to one person, to somebody else, it's not got 7 layers, it's not got enough white sauce in it, it's overseas, and whereas one person thinks it's absolutely perfect. Those are really subjective areas to be able to actually look at and judge and enforce. But then other areas such as allergens, such as food safety, hygiene, training, those areas are black and white, and they're really more the areas that you should be putting into KPIs, because actually those are the areas that if they go wrong, you're potentially going to have a serious issue and have reputational damage. So it's really important to look at those areas. Back over to you, Ed.
So in our experience, you might want to refine your KPIs to focus on important areas for improvement, or as Simon says, to reflect the changes to services that you agree over time. We sometimes see a review point short period into the agreement once a new caterer's got their feet under the table, where the parties reassess the KPI regime and how the service is working. That's all part of a healthy contract management process. You might go away from today's talk, review your contract, find that it's a caterer standard, there aren't any KPIs in there, and you might want to get one agreed with your caterer and we'd agree that. But where you do agree a new KPI or a new KPI regime with your caterer, or perhaps you agree other changes to features of the services. Speaking as the lawyer in the room, it's really important that those changes are formally documented where possible. That doesn't necessarily mean engaging your lawyers to draft detailed contract variations, but it does mean making sure that you have a written record of your agreement with your caterer as to what changes you're implementing. And if the contract specifies any formalities for that variation, that you comply with those formalities. So for example, you should record what the new KPIs are that you're implementing, how they'll be scored, where they fit into the kind of consequences of failure framework that's hopefully already set out in your agreement. There's a general rule where you're agreeing to change the way in which any elements of your contract should work. It's really important that you capture that agreement in writing and that the agreement is clear and understood by both sides, because a good number of the disputes that me and my dispute resolution colleagues see stem from a lack of clarity in the contract terms, often in the underlying contract. But as you then move through life and things happen and you vary it and changes are made, if you're not really careful to clearly document those changes, that lack of clarity that possibly already exists is only going to be magnified. So that's kind of looking back at your current contract management and how you operate with your incumbent provider. Going to look now a little bit about looking forward, so tips for procuring or reprocuring new providers. I'll let Simon run you through some of the practical and commercial elements in doing that, but first I'll give you a few of my thoughts on where the contractual bit best fits into that process. From a personal perspective, I think by some distance the most frustrating request that we get from school clients goes along the lines of, we've just completed our procurement of a new caterer, we've appointed Holroyd Howe, Chartwell, Sodexo, whoever it is, they're wonderful, sent us their contract, can you check it's okay? They're taking over the service at the end of next week. At this point in the process, having told your caterer that they're successful, presumably told the outgoing caterer that their services aren't required any longer, you've got a couple of really big problems. Your first is that the contract that the caterer sent you is almost certainly going to be quite materially deficient. It doesn't matter who your caterer is, you should expect it to be really opaque in terms of the financial terms, to the point that to me as an outsider not involved in the day-to-day budgetary detail that Simon is almost impossible to say with any certainty what you're required to pay in any given set of circumstances. You shouldn't expect that contract to afford you any meaningful influence over the cost that you're paying for. Their standard contract almost certainly won't include the sort of robust safeguarding and safer recruitment levers that you need to have in place. It might give a nod to health and safety obligations, food law obligations, but it won't do that in any detail. And as I said, you're really unlikely to have a meaningful KPI regime in there. So that's what's likely to be wrong with the contract. Your second issue is that at this stage in the process, you've got almost no leverage in securing changes to it. You've nailed your colours to that caterer's mask. Any threat to go elsewhere is likely to be pretty empty. But the caterer might agree with you to make some changes, and that might be driven by a desire to get the relationship off on the right foot and to accommodate you where you can. But they're very rarely going to resist. They're very rarely going to resist the inclusion of robust safeguarding provisions. So you why they're not in there in the first place. But in terms of meaningful reallocation of risk onto the caterer, that's going to be a really uphill struggle at this stage. So the solution is to make sure that you think about your contract terms before you appoint your preferred bidder. So ideally, when you go out to tender, you should be sending your preferred contract terms to the bidding caterers and requiring that, subject to some limited exceptions, they're the terms that you require your caterer to contract on. In my experience, as soon as you need to engage on the supplier's terms, you're on the back foot. So far better to put your own requirements forward, to do that at a time when there's still competitive tension in the process between rival bidders. Now, given the particular financial models and the complexities that Simon's talked about, and given your requirements in these important contracts, it's important to make sure that you use a contract that's fit for that purpose. To that end, we've developed and engaged with Simon in developing a form of contract that can be used in that tender process. It's designed to protect schools' interests, but it's also designed to recognise that caterers have particular requirements as well, and that needs to be accommodated. And I'm sure lots of other lawyers and consultants who do work with schools in this area will have their own versions that they can share with you. Whoever you use, I'd make a plea to you not to be the school that first turns their mind to your contract terms just before contract commencement. So that's my plea on the contractual front. I'll hand back to Simon now to talk you through some of the benefits of running a regular cycle of reprocuring your services and to give you some commercial and operational tips in doing that. But before I hand back to Simon, let's see if we can have our first poll of the day. I think we've got about 50 schools represented here this morning. The Imogen can put this up on screen for us. So using the voting buttons, can you indicate whether your catering services have been put out to tender in the past 5 years? Just a quick yes or no. Simon will then give his thoughts on how well that fits with what he sees in the market. Simon.
Yeah, it's quite even, isn't it?
It certainly is, yeah. Marginally more no's than yeses.
Yes, which I have to say is fabulous to see, because we recommend that you do tender your catering services every 5 years as a minimum. It's generally experienced that caterers do get a little bit lazy if they know that you're not going out to market test, and by lazy I mean in terms of the support and the operation, but also then in terms of making sure that their costs, overheads are kind of in line with the sector average. So going out to tender is clearly the best way to actually ensure that that all of those costs are very much competitive against the market. I'm just going to give you a couple examples of some tenders that we're running at the moment. One is at a school where they've had their incumbent caterer for 10 years. They haven't tested the market. The turnover of the account is just over £300,000 a year. And just by going through this tender exercise, they realised a saving of £38,000, 11-12% of the account turnover. We're also tendering, just got to the end of doing a tender at another school, a larger school who have just under 600,000 turnover a year. And incredibly, because they've had the same caterer for 20 years and they haven't tested the market in all of that time, they're actually saving £110,000. So 20% of that overall cost is being saved. So as you can see, there are real benefits, both of either externally tendering your catering service, or as we call it, internally tendering your catering service. By internally, we ask the caterer, your incumbent caterer, to provide a proposal, basically, like they're responding to a tender specification. But they're the only company involved until or unless you decide actually you don't agree with our offer, or that you think that you could get something else from another company. In which case you would go out to market. But actually, our experience is that if you do an internal tender, your caterer will provide you with a market competitive bid, which we normally review on your behalf. There are about, this might sound a bit of a silly term, there are about 1,500 attractive schools. Apologies, you're all attractive. But attractive to a contract caterer means it's to do with your turnover. So a contract caterer rarely looks at schools with perhaps less than £250,000 annual turnover. And if each of those schools were to actually tender their catering services every 5 years, then we'd really expect to see upwards of 250, maybe 300 tenders a year. On average, probably over the last 10 years, we're experiencing about 30 schools who go out to tender a year, or 2% of the market. I just kind of still wonder what the other 270 do. Are they just on perhaps an annual rolling contract, or do they just award an extension without the terms being updated, whether that's contractual terms or the commercial financial terms? But it's certainly an area that I think that a lot of schools would benefit from having more regular external tendering. So just to quickly talk you through the process, naturally every school is different. We have a process that really starts with us coming to school to gather all the information to put together a tender specification. We sit with you and talk about which are the best caterers to invite. Some you may know, some you may have experienced in different schools previously, or they've been courting you or contacting you. And we normally look at having perhaps one large, one medium, one small, and then another within each of those categories, so that you can see the difference in perhaps the financial offers, but also the difference in the philosophy and approach of the different size caterers. And I suppose more of it perhaps is dependent on your requirements, whether it's entirely quality of food related reason for tendering, or whether actually finances comes into that kind of melting pot as well. We write a detailed specification, and then we send that out to your chosen caterers, and then we have a day at school when all the caterers come together. We have what we call as a bidders conference, when everybody gets to talk to the key personnel, the bursar, the headmaster, headmistress, and other key personnel, perhaps head of sport, etc. And then the companies go away, prepare their responses, and normally 4 to 5 weeks later send those through to us. We do an immediate analysis of finances to start off with, to check that they're in line with expectation, and then also then have a look at the narrative assessments. This then ends up with a shortlist to presentation, and normally 2 or 3 companies present, and then dependent on the number of companies, either move to preferred supplier or shortlist to 2, and then have further negotiation if it's required. But just going back to Ed's comments, the tender specification already includes the contract, and by bidding for that school catering service, you are agreeing to the contract that's already in place, which is the BWV contract and not the caterer's contract. Just looking at the timings, so traditionally there are 3 windows when a new contract would commence: new academic year, which is the most popular, New Year, and then Easter. The only issue with the new academic year, okay, it's fantastic, probably fits in with your budget year, but actually it's the most popular time, and this can lead to a dilution of support. And so we've seen more and more schools looking at certainly Easter starts, and then a few in the new year. If you're in the final year of your tenure with your incumbent provider, then you should look to start the process 2 terms prior to the start of the contract term. And this is really more around TUPE and the requirement for a reasonable amount of time to be given for the staff to decide whether they wish to transfer or not. So if you're looking for a new academic year start, then probably first thing in the new year to start that process. There is a cycle in terms of whether the outsourced service is still right for you. There is a cycle of schools who outsource and then come back in-house, and there's also a cycle between different catering companies as well. At the moment, there's still overarching that schools who are self-operated are outsourcing, but actually there are more outsourced schools now who are considering coming back in-house. But I'm hoping we can have another quick poll to see where you are in that cycle. And Imogen's just putting up some information on whether you're currently in-house, etc., and looking to change potentially. So if you wouldn't mind having a quick go at that poll, that would be great, and get some results up. Be interesting to see whether that reflects my thoughts. Yeah, so currently in-house and unlikely to change, 25%, but actually currently outsourced and unlikely to change, which is really interesting, isn't it? And it's whether you're unlikely to change as in to definitely go back in-house, obviously 8%. But this gives a clear indicator that actually tendering for those schools who say that they're not likely to change, that actually maybe doing an internal tender is the route to go down prior to perhaps awarding an extension to ensure that your deal is market competitive. Just in terms of why schools are outsourcing and are perhaps going back in-house, the majority of schools outsource actually not to save money, and even with the pandemic and the extra pressures financially that's created, most actually outsource in order to get better value for money. So, normally looking at the quality of food and what can be done better for the same budget. And the reason for a school considering going back in-house most definitely actually is to save money. That's the driver. And if it's something that you are thinking of, the small percentage you might be thinking of that, make sure you've got a really, really good manager in place. Don't go back in-house because you've got problems. Actually get your caterer to sort out your problems and then go back in-house once you've got those sorted. And again, a good manager, good head chef who will hopefully stay with you for a good number of years. Right, so just looking forward for a few minutes. So what are schools focusing on now for the future catering-wise? So yes, still whether you're retaining your incumbent, so getting better value for money still seems to be the focus rather than reducing costs. Creating contingency planning, we've been asked a lot to have a look at this to say, if we need to save 20% from our catering budget, what do we need to do? They're really tough tasks to do, if that's required, there's some tough decisions to make. So actually have that contingency plan ready to go ahead with if it's required is, I think, is a kind of a really good strategy to have. We still don't really see tendering to save money, but we think that might be kind of getting ready to start, obviously with COVID-19 and any pressures that might kind of bring to your school. And mitigating operational risk and sharing financial risk as well is something that we're seeing a lot of change, especially for the caterers who've been with you for quite some while. So I'm going to hand over to Ed now for Q&As and to wrap up.
That's great. Thanks, Simon. I'm conscious it's now 11 o'clock and I think this was slated for an hour, but so we won't hold us against anybody if they have other commitments that they need to head off to, but we'll push on for a few more minutes for those that want to stick around. And we've had a few questions in. If I take the first one, it's kind of a contract related. I'll give Simon a break for a moment, and then there's an operational one that we've had as well. We've had a question around our view on using frameworks, so Crown Commercial Services Framework, the SPOU framework for engaging contract caterers, and whether that's a route to go through, because there's already a good set of purchase terms and conditions in place that you can get access to. My view on that, personally, I'd be very cautious about doing that. What you tend to find from experience of looking at those terms and conditions is that there are provisions in there which are very much in the school's favour, which are clearly designed to be weighted heavily in your favour, and often they're so far in your favour as to put off a caterer in taking on a contract on those terms. More importantly, they're very rarely bespoke to the service that they're intended to deliver. So I'll often look at a catering contract on one of these frameworks, and actually it could just as well have been used for the delivery of widgets. There isn't the sort of bespoke catering stuff in there. It often doesn't deal adequately with the principal agent relationship that deals with the VAT arrangements. It certainly doesn't always have a decent KPI mechanism in there. It certainly won't include all the sort of safeguarding provisions that you'd expect to see. So if you're going to use them, before you go out to tender or before you use them, I'd take advice as to whether they're fit for purpose for what you need, because in my experience, often they aren't. And once you've been through the process, and you've got a caterer going through the process against those terms, again, you can be on the back foot and trying to change them to correct them for yourself. So they're a good tool, but use them with your eyes open. And we've had another question around VWE contracts. So the question there is around whether we've had that current contract tested, I guess kind of road tested. It's relatively new. We developed it with Simon 18 months ago now.
18 months, yes.
So it's been through one round of Simon perhaps will be able to comment in a bit more detail on sort of his experience of using it. It's been through sort of one round of procurement processes, I guess around sort of this time summer last year, perhaps not in the numbers given COVID that you might have liked. So it has been through the process. Has it been road tested? Well, we've had a lot of experience of catering contracts, which is where things go wrong. We've had quite a bit of experience of how far you can push caterers in terms of what you can get out of them. So the contract is designed to sort of give you the best of both worlds, in that it takes you as far as you can without pushing a caterer so far that you're going to put them off bidding or potentially have a detrimental impact on the commercial deal that you're being offered. So, Simon, you may have, having sort of used it in anger, you've supported schools in doing so, you may have observations on how it works.
Yeah, sure. It's strangely been quite well received by the caterers, and I think it's because it is fair and equitable, but clearly the school there's a lot of protection for the school within the contract, and there are some areas that we've moved away from our previous kind of normal operating, which is, for example, there's an opportunity for either party at any time to finish the contract, to serve notice, whereas before we had break periods, and those type of things actually I think are very much fair for both parties. So yeah, it's been well received, and yeah, it's been tested in the market. It's been probably used 15 times to date.
What I'd say, and the same with the CCS contract, is do read it, make sure you understand it, and ensure that you're comfortable with the terms that you're going to be operating in practice. Because once you've got it in place, it's your tool. It's the thing that gives you the weapons in the armory to deal with your caterer. So it is important that you get your head around it, with support from Simon or from us or whoever the lawyers are that you might use on that sort of thing. We've had a more operational question, Simon, around whether there's a kind of rule of thumb for numbers of staff against sort of number of daily covers, whether it's a sort of, I guess, a practical one, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned right at the start that I forwarded some data that we prepare for the ISBA, the Bursars Association, every year. It's Catering Budget Benchmark Guidelines, and you'll find all the information that you need in there in terms of actually determining whether you have the right level and kind of labour structure. Just very quickly, there are two ways of actually determining what the structure should be and whether it's efficient. The first is to work out the number of meals that are produced for every man-hour worked. So simply add up the number of meals that are served every week, and then add up the number of hours that are worked per week, and divide the meals into the hours. And you should be looking ideally at between about 8.5 and 9.5 meals per hour worked. And if it's kind of any less than that, then that's probably a good time to start looking perhaps at that area in more depth. Plus, also you can calculate it as the overall cost as a percentage of the amount of food that you use. But again, rather than going through that, because it's quite complex, we'll send you out this benchmark data, so you should be able to calculate that yourself. But what I would say is, if you do that and you would just like any advice at all, just as a kind of an email exchange, then that's absolutely no issue. Please go ahead and contact me.
Great. Well, I think that's can't see any more questions coming through just now, so I think that's probably the right time to wrap up. Thank you, Simon. It's been really, from my perspective, hearing some of the financial detail and weeds that you get stuck into has been really interesting. So, thank you for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, thank you to everybody.
I hope you might have the opportunity to get you along again to another session in the future. Thanks everybody for listening, and apologies for running a little bit beyond the hour. There's another webinar, I think, next Tuesday on Teacher Pension Scheme, which Nassim and Simon Bevan will be running. There are lots of others coming up, which I think I'm you can see on the website. I think finally, if you don't mind, before you log off, there's a feedback box, which all training providers like to do these days, don't they? So if you don't mind just ticking in there your views on the session, and we can perhaps mould future sessions a bit more what you'd like to see. Okay, thank you very much, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you.